In this session, I'm going to talk about some results from the field just to cover some of the practical considerations if you actually implement variable rate nitrogen management using sensors. So the first thing I'll say is it doesn't require high-end equipment. You don't even really require GPS to use sensors, although it really helps so you can go back and assess what you're doing. As you can see, a lot of the work that we did was done with this old Melrose spray coupe. We did a few modifications because we were doing some research, but generally it's just a stock Melrose spray coupe, and we mounted some sensors on the boom. One of the things about our approach was that between 2008 and 2013 we worked with a lot of farmers in Maryland, and we used their equipment or ours because some of these farmers had sensor systems, so we'd let them go out and put the trials out themselves. And typically the way we like to do it is we'd put out 5 flat rates with the farmer practice right in the middle so we could see what a flat rate response was to nitrogen in the field. And then we would put out 3 different green seeker rates just because we were playing with different nozzle styles. And then we replicated all of those different rates 4 times or 5 times across the field, and we tried to do this in a very large area so that we could get some variability of the field. If you look here, you can see we had a 300-foot low-end reference strip that really shows up in this field pretty well. So we're using big plot areas. We're 300, 400, 500-foot long plots, and in that spray coupe we had a 30-foot boom on it. So the first thing that I want to mention is, typical nitrogen response in 2010 to 2012 with some of our farmers was that no nitrogen response. The more nitrogen we added, it looks like the lower yield we got. That's from the flat rate data. And what is that? Well, that was just a drought year. You can see that most of our plots were getting yields down around 40 bushels per acre, down to 30 bushels per acre. We had one kind of high yielding plot that year, 90 bushels per acre. So we had some bad years in these trials. So on average, people always say, what do you expect if I switch over to a sensor-guided variable rate nitrogen approach? And this data was provided by Wade Thomason, who developed the algorithm. And then we confirmed through all our trials that on average we were seeing about the same reductions in nitrogen. So this is corn, and what we found is about 20% less side dress nitrogen, but we didn't see any change in yield. So we got the same yield, 20% less side dress nitrogen compared to that farmer practice. In wheat, we didn't quite see the savings. Now, there was no difference in yield again, but only about 7 to 10% less nitrogen. And in wheat, I talked mainly about corn before, but you're going out in that second application, if you're split applying in the spring, putting one shot down at green up, and then coming back at about Feeks 5 with the remainder of your nitrogen and varying at that Feeks 5. And so we're managing nitrogen much more tightly in wheat than corn. So when we compare it to that standard practice, we're not seeing as much savings. But again, we're talking with Precision Ag about increasing the efficiency and that ecological intensification. So I want to make a note about averages and accuracy versus precision. So on average in 2010, compared to the farmer practice in corn, we saw a 25% reduction in side dress nitrogen applied. So when people say, well, what should I expect? I say, well, on average 25%. But let's be precise in our language here of what that means. One farmer cut their nitrogen side dress rate by 51%, another 20%. Here we had a couple 6 and 5%. So they were pretty tight just doing a flat rate standard practice compared to what we were doing with the green seeker. So in that average of 20%, you've got a lot of variability. It depends on the climate and how tightly we were already managing. These two producers here were probably putting down a little bit of a low rate, lower than they should have. And so they were pretty tight and maybe even seen a little yield loss. So let's talk about some of the limitations and challenges. Precision ag, like everything else in farming, is trade-off. And a lot of times when we talk about using sensor-guided variable rate nitrogen, because it is so complex, people say, well, I'm not going to do that. It's not worth it to me because it's too complex and there's too many moving parts. But that's just farming. Everything we do has some trade-offs, and we need to be upfront with the clients about what they can expect and what's going to be more difficult as they go down this road in order to achieve a higher level of efficiency. So the first thing is, even people that side dress are usually starting when that corn's about V4. But a V4 corn plant is pretty small, and there's a lot of soil showing through, and the sensor's going to pick that up. So we found that you've got to wait a little bit later to V6 or even later. So that's fine. That's well within the window of when the crop wants its nitrogen. The problem is, as we all know, is we have a limited window to go out and side dress, particularly on wet soils, because what will happen is if you wait till V6, surely it's going to start raining and you're going to lose a week or two and your window is just going to be too narrow to get across the field. But Equipment offsets some of that. We have a lot higher clearance equipment that allows us to wait until later and be exposed to less risk. But be upfront that the fact you're going to have a shorter application window, because with the sensors you're going to have to wait until you start to get more of a canopy developed, and so that means V6. The big one that everyone brings up is check strips. Some of these algorithms require a high-end and a low-end reference, like the Virginia Tech algorithm that I talked about. Many of the algorithms at least require a high-end reference. And as I've already described in previous segments, I really think the reference strips are required. I don't think the virtual reference is good at getting nitrogen responsiveness, and they are a logistical nightmare for some. We can simplify this. You can go out much earlier before planting. You can put them out with just a four-wheeler and a spreader. You can even throw them out by hand. But nonetheless, positioning those reference strips in the fields that you're going to side dress can be logistically challenging, and we know at that time of the year it's really tough to be doing these kinds of things. The other thing to consider is you must reduce the early application rate in many situations. A lot of farmers that are side dressing are maybe putting 80 or even 90% of their nitrogen up front and then just coming in and topping off at side dress, and that's fine under normal situations. But the problem when you're doing VRN is if you put a really high rate, particularly in corn, this is a challenge, up front, then the corn's just not going to show the potential for responsiveness. There's not going to be much variability across the field because so far we've had plenty of nitrogen out there. And so, they need to cut back to probably 20, 25, 30% of their total N requirement up front so that you've got room to play. Because the other thing is if you put 90% of your nitrogen down up front, you've only got 10%. If you were planning on putting out 200 pounds of nitrogen, that's 20 pounds that you have left to play with. That's not much of a dynamic range, so you're not going to pay for the extra expense of the equipment just varying within 20 pounds. And then the last biggest challenge is how to tell if the system was right. Skepticism. This is a new mindset. Typically, we're used to knowing how much product we're going to put down before we ever go to the field. And this may sound simple and minor, but I've found that these human challenges, these psychological challenges, if you will, are much more difficult to overcome. Because now we're saying you're not going to know how much nitrogen you're going to need until after you're done fertilizing. And this is a big challenge. We can fix anything on the equipment side, but human interactions are often difficult. So for that skepticism part, use some of the precision ag tools that you have at your disposal. Put some flat rate strips across that field in 4 or 5 random locations and look at them on the yield monitor. And after a year or two, you start to develop the confidence to go full-fledged into this technique. Equipment capability. One thing that you want to look at is prescriptions should not be developed without consideration of controller performance. So what we've got here is 1 gallon per acre change in the red line over an NDVI change of 0.05. And then down here, over that same NDVI range, we're changing 2.5 gallon per acre. So before you start side dressing, you'll get a graph like this to show what the performance of the system is going to be. And most pieces of equipment aren't going to be able to make these changes of 2.5 gallons that quickly. So you kind of want to make sure you're within a realistic range that your equipment can handle. You might need a fast switching controller on your sprayer to change that flow rate. So if you'll remember that old spray coop that we started out with, this is the top of it. And again, I said we did some modifications for research, and we put a little bit higher performance flow meter on it, and we put a fast switching control valve on it because the one that was stock just wasn't getting the performance we needed. So these are some things that you're going to want to consider having on your equipment. There are a lot of nozzles available for precision ag applications. And so here are 2 examples that we tested out and compared to the old fixed orifice models. And they basically, this one here we see has a spring with a little ball valve in there. And so basically it opens up the orifice wider as we throw more flow to it so we don't have the high pressure jumps. This other one here, it's got a rubber disc in it with a slit on the side of it, and it does the same thing. Basically that orifice is going to open up to allow more flow so we don't get the pressure jump. And we found a little bit better control, and we were grabbing the rates a little bit better than we were with the fixed discs. And the one thing is when we're changing from field to field, we didn't have to switch out the discs as much. Now just having the old-fashioned fixed discs worked fine, but we had to switch them out when we went between fields. So I said we made some modifications for research, and I just want to show you it was a pretty simple modification. So all we did was we added about a 20 horsepower motor to control our pump on this old spray coop because that little Volkswagen engine just wasn't getting the job done. And if we had hills on our plots, we always had to be headed downhill because we couldn't hit our rates and climb the hill. So that's all we did really from a research standpoint to be able to hit the different rates, was we put an auxiliary power source on to drive the pump on that sprayer. So how did that, basically low-tech equipment, nowhere near what we see in farmer fields today, perform as far as hitting the target rates? Well, what we see here is on the vertical axis, we see the applied rate, and across the horizontal axis, we see the prescribed rate that the sensors were calling for. And there's a lot of scatter around that one-to-one line, okay? But in general, we were almost at the one-to-one line with a slope of 0.9 on this line. And that scatter's normal. It's not going to jump the rates every second. The question is, were we following the general trend? Were we doing better than if we applied the same rate across the whole field, which if we plotted that on here, we'd just have one simple line across that one rate, and we'd be way off if we assume the technology is right from where we should have been. Here's another way to look at that. I just took one site in one year, 2009, and we look at what was actually being applied, the blue line, and then we have this magenta line, which is the prescribed rate. When you see these big spikes in the prescribed rate, those are turn rows as we go across the field. And so the prescribed rate is jumping up and down quickly, and the applied rate is smoothing out what it's asking for. And are we following the general trend? As we travel across the field and the rate that's being asked for goes up, are we hitting it? And that's what we need to get at. We don't have to be hitting that rate exactly right on the point. A lot of people kind of get carried away and they hold precision ag to a different standard than traditional agricultural. And they say, well, if you're calling for 10 gallons per acre for 1 second, we want to be right on that 10 gallons, and then we want to be right on the next, whatever it's calling for, 15 gallons per acre. But we're trying to follow these general trends of what we think the crop needs. And we do a pretty good job even with low-tech equipment. So in summary, when you're using sensors to guide variable rate nitrogen, it requires that you're already comfortable with side dressing the majority of your nitrogen. I think it's too far of an emotional leap to go from pre-plant nitrogen to variable rate side dress nitrogen. I think we really need the reference strips. The virtual references aren't going to get us there as far as nitrogen responsiveness. And understand that's not always right. The sensor, it's just another tool in the toolbox. It's not going to be exactly right all the time, but the research indicates that it is correct more often than the flat rate you're currently using, because it is trying to adjust to some season-to-season variability and spatial variability across that field. There are different sensor technologies out there, but it's really the algorithm that matters. So look into the algorithm you're using, make sure you understand it, and ask the questions you need to ask to know what you're doing when you go out there with sensor-guided variable rate nitrogen. With that, if you ever need to contact me, there's my email address, josh.mcgrath@uky.edu, and you can follow me on Twitter, npk_professor.